Today I'm going to share 5 different ways to finish your seams when sewing. So the first way is with a serger. So a serged edge looks like this, and you've probably seen it before on the inside of any store-bought garments that you may have, because that's typically what is used. And it's done on a serger, which is this machine here that uses 4 cones of thread at a time. So to use a serger, obviously you have to turn it on. And sergers, most of them anyway, have a blade which will trim the fabric as you go. So I line the edge of my fabric up with that blade, and then the serger just has a pedal foot, just like a sewing machine. So you go ahead and press it down, and you guide it through, like I said, lining up with that blade, which trims it. And when you're finished, because of the way a serger is done, you have to run a long tail before you trim off your fabric. So serging is definitely my preferred method for finishing seams because it is pretty quick and easy to do. However, there are a couple of downsides, mainly because it is another machine. So you have the cost associated with buying another machine, as well as having to have a place to have it set up or to store it. So the remaining finishes are a little more budget friendly, and the first is pinking shears. Now, I don't know if anybody else grew up with these, but when I was younger, Mom always had these cut like a zigzag on the edge of your fabric. But what you do is you take your fabric and you sew it like you normally would, and then you use the pinking shears just to trim off that edge. And this zigzag edge is what keeps it from unraveling, because it apparently shortens the fiber length so that it's less likely to unravel, as well as it's basically putting in a little bit of a bias cut right there along the edges. So the next method is a zigzag stitch. So I'm going to set my sewing machine to a zigzag stitch in a somewhat shorter length and width. So with that set, I am just going to sew, positioning my fabric so that one side of the stitch goes into the material and the other just goes off the edge. So I need to move it over a little. So this is another method that I don't tend to prefer, just because I like the neater finish of pretty much anything other than this one and the pinking shears. But my understanding is that it works because it's going off the edge and kind of overlocking it, similar to what the serger does, but without the helpful knife that cleans off the edges, and not as dense as the serging is. Now I am starting to use this one more when doing doll clothes, just because those seam allowances are so narrow that using a serger just doesn't work. Method number 4 is the French seam, and I've already done a short doing this in more detail, so I'm just going to kind of overview it here and link that in the description. So with this method, you're going to actually start by placing your fabric with the wrong sides together. That's opposite of what you would normally do, because normally you would sew everything with the right sides together. And then you're going to sew half of your seam allowance. So I've been using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch here. So then you're going to take it and fold it the opposite way so that the right sides are together. If this is an actual project, you would of course press the seam so that it would lay better. And go back to the machine and sew it again, still doing half your seam allowance. And you can see that encloses the raw edges into the seam. Now personally, if I'm not going to use the serger, this is my preferred alternate method for finishing seams. It looks really nice, especially on sheer items, but I also know that there are a lot of people who have a little bit of a harder time with this one, because you have to remember to sew things wrong sides together the first time and right sides together the second time, and you have to do a little bit of math in order to figure out your seam allowance and all of that. The last method is the flat felt seam, and this is a method that I pretty much only use when I'm making my dad a dress shirt, but it does have a pretty cool effect. So this one starts by sewing the seam allowance as normal. By the way, I have done all of these in red thread just so you can see it better. And then you press your seam open a little and trim down one side of the seam. So only one layer by about half. So then you take the longer half, wrap it around the raw edge of the side that you trimmed under or trimmed down, and then fold it all over toward the trimmed seam. I'm going to pin it in place for now, then I'll go and sew it. And hopefully you can see basically that raw edge is completely turned under. Then come over to the sewing machine and just sew it down. And this seam is really interesting because you can actually do it one of two ways. So the first is like I just showed you, where you sew it with the right sides together. And in that case, you will only see one of these stitching lines. And obviously, ideally, you would be using a matching thread for this. You wouldn't have bright red. The other option is that you can actually sew it with the wrong sides together. And in that case, you would end up with both of the lines of stitching visible. And this can actually be a design feature. It's, I think, used on jeans, and I know it's used on dress shirts because I use both ways when making ones for my dad. There you have it, 5 different ways to finish seams. I'm sure there are more, but these are the 5 that came to mind for me. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. And I hope you'll join me next time for another handmade happening.